As the news of the pregnant pretty girl spread through the school, Ifeanyi felt the walls closing in around him. He desperately wished his mother was there to clean up this mess. But for the first time in his life, he was truly on his own. Principal Olu called Ifeanyi into his office. His face a mask of disappointment and anger. "Mr. Ifeanyi," he said, his voice tight with suppressed rage. "Would you care to explain how 3 of our students are pregnant? And all signs point to you as the father." Ifeanyi's mind raced, searching for an excuse, a way out. But for once, his charm failed him. "Sir, I can explain." But Mr. Olu held up a hand, silencing him. "Save it, Mr. Ifeanyi. We trusted you with those girls. You are supposed to teach them, to guide them. Instead, you took advantage of them in the worst possible way." Ifeanyi slumped in his chair, the weight of his actions finally hitting him. What's going to happen now?" Mr. Olu's voice was cold. "I've already contacted the NYSC headquarters. Your service here is terminated, effective immediately. As for legal consequences, that will depend on the girls and their families. But mark my words, Mr. Ifeanyi, you will face the consequences of your actions." As Ifeanyi left the principal's office, he felt as if he was in a daze. The hallways that once echoed with admiring whispers now seemed to close in on him, filled with accusing stares and hushed conversations. He made his way to his quarters, his mind reeling. How had it all gone so wrong? Ifeanyi felt truly afraid. His mother wasn't here to fix this, to make it all go away. With shaking hands, he pulled out his phone and dialed his mother's number. "Mom," he said, his voice cracking. "I'm in trouble, big trouble." Madam Chioma's voice came through, filled with concern. "Ifeanyi, what's wrong? What's happened?" As Ifeanyi explained the situation, he could hear his mother's sharp intake of breath, followed by a long silence. "Mom," he said, fear creeping into his voice. "Mom, are you there?" When Madam Chioma finally spoke, her voice was unlike anything Ifeanyi had ever heard before. It was cold, disappointed, and scared. "Ifeanyi," she said, "come home. Come home right now." As Ifeanyi packed his belongings, his mind raced with thoughts of how his mother would fix this, how she would make it all go away like she always did. But a nagging voice in the back of his mind whispered that this time, things might be different. Little did Ifeanyi know that even bigger surprises were waiting for him at home. His world built on privilege and impunity was about to come crashing down around him. As Ifeanyi's car pulled up to his family's mansion, he was surprised to see his mother waiting for him on the front steps. Madam Chioma's usual polished appearance was gone. Her hair was disheveled and her eyes were red and puffy from crying. "Mom, what's going on?" Madam Chioma didn't move to embrace him as she usually would. Instead, she stared at him with a mixture of disappointment and fear. "Come inside, Ifeanyi. We need to talk." As they entered the living room, Ifeanyi was shocked to see several suitcases packed and ready by the door. "Mom, are we going somewhere?" Madam Chioma sank into an armchair, suddenly looking much older than her years. "Sit down, Ifeanyi. There's something I need to tell you." Ifeanyi sat on the edge of the sofa, his heart pounding. "Mom, whatever it is, we can fix it. We always do." Madam Chioma shook her head slowly. "Not this time, Ifeanyi. This time, we've lost everything." "What do you mean, everything?" Ifeanyi asked, his voice rising in panic. Madam Chioma took a deep breath. "I made a bad investment. A very bad investment. I was promised quick returns, but it was all a scam. Ifeanyi, we've lost all our money." Ifeanyi felt as if the floor had dropped out from under him. "All of it." "But what about your other businesses, the properties?" "Gone," Madam Chioma said, her voice hollow. I had to sell everything to pay off the debts. This house, it's the last thing we have, and we have to sell it too. Ifeanyi jumped to his feet. No, you can't be serious. There must be something we can do. Madam Chioma looked up at her son, tears in her eyes. Ifeanyi, sit down. There's more. As Ifeanyi sank back onto the sofa, Madam Chioma continued. The school called me. They told me everything about the girls, the pregnancies. Ifeanyi's face drained of color. Mom, I can explain. But Madam Chioma held up her hand to stop him. No, Ifeanyi, no more explanations. No more excuses. Do you have any idea what you've done? The lives you've ruined. For the first time in his life, Ifeanyi saw real anger in his mother's eyes. It scared him more than anything else. The school is pressing charges, Ifeanyi, Madam Chioma said, her voice trembling. And the girls' families, they are suing us for everything we have left. Ifeanyi felt as if he was drowning. But you can fix this, right? You always fix everything. Madam Chioma laughed a bitter, broken sound. Fix it. Ifeanyi, don't you understand? There's nothing left to fix. We have no money, no influence, nothing. We are ruined. As the reality of the situation sank in, Ifeanyi broke down. Mom, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I never meant for this to happen. Madam Chioma looked at her son, and for the first time, she saw him not as her perfect golden boy, but as the deeply flawed young man he had become. I know, Ifeanyi, and that's my fault. I failed you as a mother. I gave you everything except the one thing you really needed, guidance. Just then, there was a loud knock at the door. Madam Chioma stiffened. That would be the police. Ifeanyi's eyes widened in fear. The police. Mom, what do we do? Madam Chioma stood up, straightening her clothes. We face the consequences of our actions, Ifeanyi. It's long overdue. As Madam Chioma opened the door, she saw two police officers standing outside. Madam Chioma, one of them asked. When she nodded, he continued. We are here to speak with Ifeanyi Okafor. Ifeanyi stepped forward, his legs shaking. I'm Ifeanyi, the officer nodded. Mr. Okafor, we have a warrant for your arrest on charges of sexual misconduct with minors. You'll need to come with us. As the officers handcuffed Ifeanyi, reality finally hit him. This wasn't a bad dream he could wake up from. This was real, and there was no escaping it. Mom, Ifeanyi called out, his voice breaking as the officers led him to the police car. Madam Chioma stood in the doorway, tears streaming down her face. I'm sorry, Ifeanyi. I'm so sorry. As the police car drove away, Madam Chioma sank to her knees on the front steps of the house that was no longer hers. Her empire had crumbled. Her son was facing jail time, and she was left with nothing but the bitter realization of her own failures. Meanwhile, at the Light Secondary School, Joy, Beauty, and Precious sat in the principal's office with their parents. The atmosphere was tense, filled with anger, disappointment, and fear. Mr. Olu addressed the group, his voice grave. I cannot express how deeply sorry we are for what has happened. We trusted Mr. Ifeanyi, and he betrayed that trust in the worst possible way. Joy's father spoke up. Sorry doesn't cut it, Principal. Our daughters' lives are ruined because of your negligence. Beauty's mother, tears in her eyes, turned to her daughter. How could you let this happen, Beauty? We raised you better than this. Beauty sobbed, unable to meet her mother's eyes. I'm sorry, Mama. He made me feel special. I thought he loved me. Precious, usually the most outspoken of the three, sat silently, her hands resting protectively over her stomach. Mr. Olu cleared his throat. We've contacted the authorities. Mr. Ifoni will face the full consequences of his actions. As for the girls, we want to assure you that the school will provide all the support we can. Joy's mother, her voice shaking with emotion, asked, "And what about their education? Their future?" Mr. Olu nodded solemnly. "We will make arrangements for them to continue their studies from home if they wish. Their graduation and final exams will not be affected." Weeks passed. Ifoni sat in a holding cell awaiting trial. The boy who once had everything, now had nothing. No fancy clothes, no adoring fans, not even his mother's unconditional support. His cellmate, an older man named Emeka, watched as Ifoni paced back and forth in their small cell. "You're going to wear a hole in the floor, young man," Emeka said. Ifoni stopped pacing and looked at Emeka. "How did I end up here? This wasn't supposed to happen to me." Emeka raised an eyebrow. "Oof, and who was it supposed to happen to?" Ifoni sank onto his bunk, his head in his hands. "I don't know anyone but me. My mother, she always fixed everything. I never had to face consequences before." Emeka nodded slowly. "Oh, I see. You're one of those silver spoon kids, eh? Well, let me tell you something, young man. In here, everyone is equal. Your mother's money can't help you now." Ifoni looked up, his eyes filled with fear. "What's going to happen to me?" Emeka shrugged. "That depends on the judge. But more importantly, it depends on you. Are you going to learn from this? Or are you going to keep thinking you're above the law?" As Ifoni pondered Emeka's words, he realized that he was truly on his own. No mother to bail him out. No charm to talk his way out of trouble. He would have to face the consequences of his actions. And the road ahead looked long and hard. Meanwhile, Madam Chioma had moved into a small dingy apartment in a poor neighborhood. The woman who once hosted lavish parties now struggled to pay rent and buy food. One evening, as she sat on her threadbare couch, there was a knock at the door. When she opened it, she was surprised to see Amina, her old friend, who had warned her about spoiling Ifoni all those years ago. "Amina," Madam Chioma said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing here?" Amina's eyes were filled with a mixture of sadness and compassion. "I heard about what happened, Chioma. I came to see if you needed anything." Madam Chioma's pride warred with her desperation. Finally, she stepped aside. "Please, come in." As they sat in the tiny living room, Amina took in her old friend's appearance. The designer clothes replaced by cheap worn garments, the once perfectly manicured nails now chipped and broken. "Oh, Chioma," Amina sighed. "I'm so sorry it's come to this." Madam Chioma's eyes filled with tears. "You were right, Amina. You were right about everything. I spoiled Ifoni, and now he's in jail. And those poor girls." Amina reached out and took Chioma's hand. "What's done is done, Chioma. The question is, what are you going to do now?" Madam Chioma shook her head helplessly. "I don't know. I've lost everything." The courtroom was packed with curious onlookers, reporters, and the families of Joy, Beauty, and Precious. Ifoni sat at the defender's table. He looked nothing like the confident, charming young man he once was. His eyes were sunken, his posture deflated. Madam Chioma sat in the gallery, her hands trembling as she watched her son. Amina sat beside her, offering silent support. The judge called the court to order. "We are here today for the case of the state versus Ifoni Okafor. Mr. Okafor is charged with 3 counts of sexual misconduct with minors. How does the defendant plead?" Ifoni's court-appointed lawyer stood up. "Your Honor, my client pleads guilty to all charges." Madam Chioma gasped, tears streaming down her face. The judge nodded. "Very well. We will proceed to hear impact statements from the victims before sentencing. One by one, Joy, Beauty, and Precious took the stand. Their words were heartbreaking, filled with pain, anger, and lost innocence. Joy spoke first, her voice shaking. I trusted you, Mr. Ifani. We all did. You were supposed to be our teacher, someone we could look up to. Instead, you took advantage of us. You made me feel special, only to use me for your own selfish desires. Now I'm about to become a mother when I'm still a child myself. How is that fair? Beauty was next. She couldn't look at Ifani as she spoke. I thought what we had was love. I thought I was mature enough to handle it. But I was wrong. You knew better, Mr. Ifani. You knew what you were doing was wrong, but you did it anyway. Now my life will never be the same. Precious was the last to speak. Her words were filled with anger. You disgust me, Mr. Ifani. You came to our school pretending to be this great teacher, but you were nothing but a predator. I hate you for what you've done to me, to my friends, to our families. I hope you rot in jail. Finally, it was time for Ifani to speak. He stood up, his legs shaking. Your Honor, he began, his voice barely above a whisper. I know that nothing I say can undo what I've done. I've hurt these girls in ways I'm only now beginning to understand. I've disappointed my mother, who gave me everything. I've abused the trust placed in me as a teacher. He paused, taking a deep breath. I'm guilty, Your Honor. I deserve whatever punishment the court decides. I only hope that someday, somehow, I can make amends for the pain I've caused. The judge listened impassively. When Ifani finished, he spoke. Mr. Okafor, your actions have caused immeasurable harm. You took advantage of your position of authority and betrayed the trust placed in you. The court sentences you to 10 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 7 years. Additionally, you will be registered as a sex offender and will be barred from ever working with minors again. As the gavel came down, Madam Chioma let out a sob. Amina held her friend tightly as they watched Ifani being led away in handcuffs. Madam Chioma stumbled out of the courthouse, supported by Amina. The reporters turned their attention to her, shouting questions. Madam Chioma, how do you feel about your son's sentence? Do you take any responsibility for Ifani's actions? What do you have to say to the victims? Amina tried to push through the crowd, but Madam Chioma stopped. She turned to face the reporters. Her face etched with sorrow and regret. I failed, she said, her voice cracking. I failed as a mother. I gave my son everything except the guidance he needed. To the girls and their families, I am so deeply sorry. I know my words mean little, but I promise to spend the rest of my life trying to make amends for the pain my son has caused. Weeks turned into months, and months into years. Ifani adjusted to life in prison, the harsh reality of his new existence, a far cry from the privileged life he once knew. One day, during visiting hours, Madam Chioma came to see him. She looked older, her hair streaked with grey, but there was a newfound strength in her eyes. Mom, Ifani said, his voice filled with surprise and shame. I didn't think you'd come. Madam Chioma sat down across from him. I almost didn't, but I realized that running away from our problems is what got us here in the first place. Ifani nodded, unable to meet her eyes. How are you doing? I'm surviving, Madam Chioma replied. I've started a small business, selling homemade snacks. It's not much, but it's honest work. Ifani looked up, surprised. You are working? Madam Chioma smiled sadly. Yes, Ifani, I'm learning to stand on my own 2 feet, something I should have taught you long ago. They sat in silence for a moment before Ifani spoke again. Mom, I'm sorry, for everything. I know it's not enough, but I want you to know that I understand now. I see what I did wrong, how I hurt those girls, how I let you down. Madam Chioma reached out and took her son's hand. I'm sorry too, Ifeanyi. I failed you as a mother, but it's not too late for us to learn from our mistakes. It won't be easy, but we can try to be better. As their visiting time came to an end, Ifeanyi asked, will you come again? Madam Chioma nodded. Yes, I will. We have a lot of work to do, you and I, but we'll do it together. Meanwhile, Joy, Beauty, and Precious were learning to navigate their new lives as young mothers. The school had kept its promise, allowing them to complete their education from home. One afternoon, the three girls met at Joy's house, their babies playing on a blanket nearby. Can you believe it's been 2 years? Beauty asked. Precious nodded, her eyes on her daughter. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like a lifetime ago. Joy sighed. I wonder what our lives would be like if things had been different. We can't think like that, Precious said firmly. What happened, happened. We can't change the past, but we can shape our future. Beauty smiled. When did you get so wise, Precious? Precious grinned. Motherhood does that to you, I guess. As they watched their children play, the three friends felt a mix of emotions. Sadness for the childhood they had lost. Anger at the man who had taken advantage of them, but also hope for the future they were building. Joy picked up her daughter, hugging her close. We are going to be okay, aren't we? Yes, Beauty said softly. We are going to be okay. Precious nodded. We are survivors, and we are in this together. The three young mothers held on to each other and their children, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The end. Moral of the story: train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not